Secar, kolla kısa dök bir çay. Fabrika parça başı, yettirdin mi maaşı? Ev içi görülmez emek, sigorta yok, yol ve yemek. Ne liberal zamanlar, burada herkes bırakar. Burada herkes bırakar. Yek secar, ne yerim ne yerim dar. Ev kira sokak bizim, değil benim krizim. İşsizdir tüm çalışanlar, mavi beyaz ne farkın var? Hakimiyse yasalar, yıkılsın piyasalar. Yıkılsın piyasalar. Yıkılsın piyasalar. Yıkılsın piyasalar.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's show. Today, the Red Radio Show goes back to the US to discuss about the monumental movement against police brutality that has started after the most blatant murder that we have seen of George Floyd from the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Police brutality against people of color and immigrants is not foreign to any country, and that's why when the movement erupted in the US, it was immediately spread all over the world with demonstration in many countries. In many countries as well, we see the police to answer to the movement with even more brutality and tear gas and persecutions, providing the police brutality and police unaccountability is not only a problem in the US, but in any capitalist society of the world. In Cyprus, we saw police brutality against immigrants and people of color that exacerbated during the lockdown. And for us, it's even more important that we have the chance to discuss with Ginger Jentzen, a member of the Socialist Alternative Minneapolis in Minnesota, in the from the US section of the ISA. Hello, Ginger. Welcome to our show.
Thanks.
Ginger, we all saw the video. It was a horrific murder. And we have to say that George Floyd was not murdered because he was a gang member or carrying a weapon or any other criminal activity. But the police aggressively arrested him based on a report that someone in the area tried to use a fake $20 bill. Do you think it was the act of the police violence that was the driving force, or was it the economic situation that the whole COVID-19 has created to the Black community, but also generally to the working class in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the key questions in a lot of ways. I think the absolutely brutal murder of George Floyd was the spark, and it was, a factor that people had been facing lockdowns and quarantine for months before. But truly, this was just the straw that broke the camel's back. About a month prior, we saw the horrific murder by, some right-leaning kind of white supremacists of Ahmaud Arbery. Only a few days before George Floyd's murder, there was the murder of Breonna Taylor aggressively by police in a no-knock warrant where they just entered her home and murdered her without much discussion at all. And George Floyd, what we saw initially from the police response was a report that they issued saying that George Floyd had suffered a personal crisis, that something had happened, but that he had resisted arrest. And when the video came out and people saw, broadly speaking, that the police had blatantly lied in their recounting of the situation, it was too much, I think, for the moment. And it was truly what drew people out into the streets immediately. We saw just within 24 hours of the video's release that hundreds of people were gathered at the site of his murder. But I think that the question you're asking is truly what, are these underlying factors? we're looking at nearly 40 million people in the US right now currently unemployed as a result of the COVID-19 triggered economic crisis. We're talking about the majority of people in the US not having access, upwards of 70 million, not having access to adequate healthcare, or millions losing their employer-provided healthcare as a result of the COVID crisis. And so for many people, I think what we're seeing is just a deepening of the enormously catastrophic economic inequality that exists, with Black communities, Black working class communities experiencing this at disproportionately high rates. I think the fact that George Floyd was murdered for this crime of poverty, as you pointed out, is truly, I think, a sign of the situation that we're facing, and that in a lot of ways, it's the last time that the Black community really wants to discuss, the platitudes that we've heard before. On all of the demonstrations, we're hearing that this needs to be about a deep reckoning of US capitalism, truly, that we need to talk about living wage jobs. We need to talk about truly having affordable housing for working class people, and access to, the adequate healthcare that people need. And that already, less than 2 weeks later, a lot of these demands have become a part of the deeper political discussion around how can we actually end economic and racial inequality in the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing, because I actually, during the coronavirus, the Black community was hit much harder than anybody, with 13,000, if I'm not mistaken, more deaths than the rest of the population. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, but it was not the first time that we saw a Black Lives Matter movement, wasn't it? We had some years ago, we had the movement that started from Ferguson. Again, this came as news and as provoke some solidarity, but at the same time, it has very big differences than today, isn't it? I mean, first of all, it's more multiracial. Okay, I should not say that. You should be answering the question. It is a discussion. I mean, how much there is now today. We're not just having a Black community movement, isn't it? It's a more generalized movement that we see in the streets of the US.
Yeah, in Minneapolis, I'll speak to that first. Of course, George Floyd was murdered on May 28th or May 25th. So this is just about 2 weeks later when we're speaking now. And now we've seen, while initially in Minneapolis, it was truly a working class rebellion. Is that good? It was truly a working class rebellion that was led by young people of color. And it was a continuous, basically 24-hour protests. There were kind of thousands of people moving around and going into, almost continuous confrontations with the police. And in many ways, it was actually quite heroic in that the youth were basically saying the future that they are facing is one of basically low-wage jobs, unaffordability, and in many ways, they've been the first to lose employment as a result of the COVID crisis. And so, already, and also actually many of these young people had taken part on some of the international demonstrations against climate change and climate catastrophe. I think the radicalization that's happening amongst this youngest generation right now is looking to the sort of international movements and the grassroots, ground up building of something that can and should look very different from the experience that they've had up to this point. And I think that is a bit of an advancement from what the movement for Black Lives had first experienced in the Ferguson demonstrations. And in many ways, the movement's been tested in various localities where you have, this sort of explosive movement initially coming out in response, and then potentially some of the demands, maybe for there being a bit more representation within the city establishment, or, there have been elections where We've now have, people of color on different boards or playing a role as a police chief or something like that. And then when this youngest generation has seen that actually nothing has changed, we're still seeing our brothers, our fathers, our mothers, our sisters being murdered, or, there being an anti-immigrant, bigotry or violence coming from the police force. In reality, they're drawing the conclusion that this is deeply rooted in the system as it exists right now. Now that I don't want to overstate the anti-capitalist conclusions that are being drawn in the movement at the moment, but it's, I think, a key part of, in the context of the presidential election as well. You have the incredibly bigoted Donald Trump as the president right now, who has emboldened reactionary right-wing violence across the country over the past 4 years. And then you also have Joe Biden, who was one of the key architects for the modern, deeply racist mass incarceration system in the US and the private prison industrial complex, which has benefited the elite, which is only about enriching a few people at the expense of the deeply racist system as it exists in the US right now. So, I think what we're looking at is a movement at this moment that will not be immediately appeased by sort of superficial changes to the structure of a police force or to the city establishment. It's going to, I think, require a lot more. And Minneapolis is a bit of a transition. We're no longer having these 24-hour protests. And we are really, I think, facing a moment where the city establishment is now coming out to try and start to make these promises to appease the movement. And I think that the reckoning is about how can we actually win real structural change. The city council was saying people needed to go home because there was this vigilante violence and there was looting happening and all of this. But I think we need to be clear about who is destroying our city. It's the racist police, it's the political establishment, and it's the big corporations. And, while the economy has been crumbling around working class people, the liberal establishment has not been fighting for us. It's in the context of the COVID crisis, you've had frontline workers begging and trying to win personal protective equipment just so they can do their own job. And in some ways, this has also been one of the impacts of, the higher rates of COVID contraction in the Black community. There are 3 times higher rates of COVID contraction and 6 times higher rates of death, in part because so many are frontline workers, also in part because of underlying health conditions as a result of, a lack of access to healthcare and very basic needs of the working class here. So we're actually facing a situation where we need to actually wage a political struggle against the establishment. And across the country, it's actually the Democratic Party that is running most of these major cities that have experienced this rebellion, And the last thing I'll say, and then, I'd love to hear from you again, and we can get more into it. But we're looking at, the wealthiest elite in the US have profited more than $434 billion since the beginning of the COVID crisis. If that doesn't say so much about the situation, and what we've seen continuously is people are pointing out the real looters right now are these corporations who are absolutely siphoning off, are absolutely parasitically taking money out of our communities right now and leaving it to the working class communities to defend themselves in the face of racist police violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will take you back to the beginning of the movement, actually, because one of the questions that was coming out as we were seeing the pictures from the news, etc., was who started these demonstrations. There were a lot of discussions about the looting, because, of course, the capitalist media, together with the pictures of the big demonstrations, they were showing the looters, and also they were showing Trump saying it's the anarchists that organized it, and that we will declare them as terrorists, etc. So who actually started it, and what is your opinion on this kind of situation that was developed?
Well, we saw on the front lines and at night on a lot of these demonstrations that it truly was a working class rebellion with, young people of color at the head of it. You know, many of these were teenagers and, you know, again, very young people who I think were immediately responding to, you know, this sort of idea that what future can you have if you're going to have to always be worried about the question of police violence, looking over your shoulder, any interaction with police could be your last. And the antisocial elements of looting started to develop after a few days of the continuous protests. And I think, you know, in some respects, what we saw was the police actually did nothing. And the city hall here used the antisocial behavior as an excuse to appeal to the governor to bring out the National Guard, which is a form of, you know, standing military in the US. And it is very uncommon to have the Guard called out. It was actually rather unprecedented in Minneapolis, with the exception of a point in the early 80s when the Guard was called out, and then actually hearkening back to the 1934 Teamster strike that was led by socialist Trotskyists. That was an enormous turning point in the labor movement in the US that led to actually just a massive resurgence of collective bargaining rights and collective action on the behalf of, you know, working class people in the United States. And it was actually in 1934 when the Guard was called out that they were used to break up the strike, which I think was also a useful education here for people to see the Guard called out again in this way. And what we've seen is that the Guard have played basically no positive role at all. They proved to be an armored escort of the police throughout the city of Minneapolis. There were videos of the Guard allowing the police to shoot rubber bullets at people who were sitting on their porch during the curfew. And, you know, while the city establishment was talking about white supremacists as the main sort of thing that working class people should fear, in reality, the National Guard haven't arrested a single one to anyone's knowledge, you know? So for a while, what the city was saying was, you know, due to the antisocial behavior of looting and fires getting started across the city, you shouldn't be in the streets because we can't do anything about the police, and you should be at home doing nothing, afraid of white supremacists potentially coming in. So this was just clearly an attempt to demobilize the protests that were actually already extracting a certain amount of concessions from the political establishment. You know, for one, I think the persistent protests of young people and of working class people on the front lines resulted in, it was clear that the mayor could not rely on, there was going to be no faith in the police department to root out its own problems and solve its own internal crisis and actually convict the 4 officers. So the mayor immediately called in the FBI. No one had any faith in the FBI. So eventually it was kicked to the attorney general of the state of Minnesota to actually preside over the case. And he actually elevated the charges against the first officer, Derek Chauvin, and actually charged the other 3 officers as well. So in the first phase of the movement, some of the key demands were around charging all 4 officers. You might have also seen that the 3rd Precinct police station was actually overtaken, was burned. And this was very much, I think, by the movement. And it was also in the days following, we saw polling that showed that a majority of people across the US actually supported and saw it as a legitimate move to have burned down the police station in the face of this violence. And some people were passing around a graphic that showed that Donald Trump had 42% support, Joe Biden had 46% support, but support for burning down the police precinct had 54% support. So in reality, the legitimacy of the anger that people were feeling in the face of this violence, it was actually really a testament to, I think, the depth of this crisis, and also the power of the movement, that even with some of the antisocial behavior developing with the looting, you still had a majority of people sympathetic and supporting the protests, and seeing that the protests were actually playing a key role at extracting concessions from the establishment. And one thing I would say too is that it was pretty important that on the first night of the demonstrations as well, a member of Socialist Alternative, who is a local bus driver, was at work, and he had heard they were asking through dispatch, through his employer, the Metro Transit, was being asked by the Minneapolis Police Department to offer buses and bus drivers to cart away arrested protesters. And they were planning clearly to do mass arrests in the different areas around the 3rd precinct. And so he wrote up a post basically saying, I'm going to organize with my coworkers against this. I will not drive radical youth and people of my class to jail. And in reality, the labor movement should stand in solidarity with this movement for justice for George Floyd, and that we should not be seeing one more Black working class person dying at the hands of police. And it went viral and actually led to a number of other places in New York and other jurisdictions across the country, where bus drivers also refused, in solidarity with the movement, to cart away protesters. I think this was actually a really important first step at showing the solidarity that we can see within the labor movement overall. And that happened very early on. And there have been other actions since then, which we could talk about. But just in that question to the character of the movement, it has been very multiracial, very multi-generational. And the depth of support and the broadness of support, I think, is now moving into a question of like, how can we turn this into a sustained struggle that can extract even more? Because I think with Minneapolis as having been kind of ground zero for this working class rebellion, the solidarity protests happening nationally and internationally are strengthening that need to, I think, discuss how can we turn this into something like a well-organized mass movement that can begin to address the structural racism and inequality that surrounds the police violence, by taking up these more concrete social demands for public education, for permanently affordable housing, and turning this into a real struggle of the working class kind of event against the sort of systemic structure of the state doing everything that they can to prevent us from actually winning, real, structural change against racism in the situation.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the solidarity, because we did see, I guess, as I understand, there are more trade unions going into action or discussing about showing solidarity to the movement. As I saw on Facebook, there is also a trend, Union Members for Justice for George Floyd.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. How did the rest of the trade unions react, and what is the prospect of their participation in the movement and altering or influencing this movement?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because the trade union movement in the U.S., in a lot of ways, you probably know that over years we're seeing that many people have. That the number of people involved in the trade union movement has been pushed back. It's neoliberalism. It's Ronald Reagan, having broken strikes back in the 80s. And, a lot of this pushback of consciousness and the need for to be part of a union is actually kind of a bit resurging. And some of that, I think we can thank the teacher strikes of 2017 and that massive wave of strike action that played a really critical role in, I think, showing that in reality, our solidarity and our collective action is a key part of how we're going to be able to extract, better wages, win better healthcare, win, bargaining rights and all of that. And I think also the union movement has needed to play a role in these broader social struggles. And I think it's been really exciting to see how welcomed the role of labor has been on a lot of these solidarity demonstrations. And, in the first few days after George Floyd was murdered, we saw statements come out from the Minnesota Nurses Association in solidarity with the protests, from the teachers in Minnesota. And again, like I said, I mentioned the bus drivers' action, which then led to the International of the Amalgamated Transit Union supporting all of their members in their choice to not help with police departments across the country. which I think is really important in the context of showing that you can directly take action when these situations develop, or when we face brutal murders like this, or other situations where we can very clearly show that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that's what many people within the labor movement have been highlighting in this case. I think it's also important to show that, like, again, sort of as I mentioned about Minneapolis, that we're in a bit of a transition with the movement, that now there's a real discussion happening about what comes next. And I think, we saw that the national AFL-CIO made a statement that I think, we need to point toward the actual power that exists, the social weight of the labor movement and the organizing that exists there. And I think we need to do more than just say that racist police violence is bad. Just this last weekend in Minneapolis, we saw two actions taken by unions in solidarity with the movement. And one was local grocery store workers walked off the job for 9 minutes. It was a symbolic work stoppage in solidarity with the movement, and highlighted the fact that, what they've been fighting for as well in the context of being frontline workers is the same types of things that people like George Floyd and working class people across the country are fighting for. And so we need to kind of deepen the struggle, broaden the struggle, and turn it into something that can extract real victories for working class people. As well, we saw, as a result of some of the protest actions, a few post offices were burned in South Minneapolis around where George Floyd was murdered. But this last weekend, around 60 postal workers gathered together and, along with around 100 to 200 supporters, marched from one of the burned out post offices to the George Floyd Memorial, where people have been gathering since that first day. And their main message was, we can rebuild a burned out building, but we cannot bring back the life of someone who was murdered by the police. And I think that was a key show of solidarity as well, in that, this attempt, I think, of various sections of the establishment to maybe say, go home, you need to stop protesting, you need to stop, getting organized, you need to stop demanding real kind of community agency over the process on how we're going to solve these crises. It's important to show that the labor movement, which is one of the most organized sections of the working class, is ready to stand with these protests and is ready to take a role. But also, I think they need to be fully mobilizing their membership to all of these protests and assist with solidarity contingents, and really visibly show that they're ready to play a role in the restructuring of what community safety actually looks like. And also, I think, be clear about the role that the riot police have played and the role of the National Guard, and really join in the call that they need to leave now, and that they need to be taken out of every major city in the US. The other thing I would say, again, I think it could be part of the process of showing that they have real power, but all of these actions could really lay the basis for even a one-day general strike in the city of Minneapolis toward the immediate end to the MPD's racist policing practices. But again, I think that this is something that is being discussed and can be discussed within the labor movement right now, and can be part of the overall solidarity of what it looks like to be not just dismantling the police, but fighting around the real social issues that every one of these workers lives and works in these various communities where they're facing racist police violence. And I think genuinely talking about how we can root this out and start to address it from the ground up, and as it relates to the capitalist system as well.
Mm-hmm. Talking about solidarity, there was a very questionable, there was a big discussion in Cyprus in the social media as well about whether there was actually some solidarity shown by the police. We saw some pictures of policemen kneeling down and hugging the protesters, etc. Yeah. What was really what was really happening? Did part of the police join the solidarity movement?
I mean, I think what we're seeing, I would say no doubt, there are probably some police who are truly horrified by what they saw Derek Chauvin do to George Floyd. And I think, to see the other three officers just stand by and watch a man be murdered right in front of them. However, at the same time, I would say that what many people experienced was immediately after one of the police, immediately after the police are kneeling, they're standing back up and they're still repressing protests, and they're still, pepper spraying peaceful demonstrations. And so I think that it's a complicated set of questions. And I think some of this has also led to a call across the country that if there are police unions as a part of the kind of local labor councils or as a part of the AFL-CIO, that they be removed, that they not be considered a part of the local, the local labor councils, or that they be considered on par within the AFL-CIO. Mm-hmm. That's not the case in Minneapolis. The police union is not a part of our local labor council, but we're seeing in Seattle, as one example, that there is a real call from sections of the SEIU, one of the service employee unions, and others to push the police out of and not have them be part of the same labor council there. And I think it's, the Police Officers Guild. And I think that this is an important set of questions in a lot of ways, because I think of course, socialists support the labor movement making every attempt to confront racism within its ranks. But I think we should also be sober about what the disaffiliation, what impact that could actually have. Because, in a lot of ways, we've seen there are some non-union police departments across the South and in other parts of the Southwest of the United States. And as I said, in Minneapolis, they have operated independently of the Labor Council here. But, this hasn't helped to rein in, violent or racist policing. And it's understandable that people are sort of seeing, what are the different pressure points which we could have an impact on how policing happens. But I think that, we can put demands on, in some ways, the police force. I think if there are genuine police officers within, these different forces, they should be really waging a battle to get rid of, if it's a racist leadership problem, then they should be waging an internal battle to get rid of that racist leadership. I think no police union should be on labor bodies until they take a stand against this type of racist policing, as well as their role in breaking up strikes and other uprisings of the working class. But I also think that this should not be the key focus of the movement. And I think in many ways, the fact that the police union is becoming a key focus in Minneapolis is in part, it's the mayor and it's the city council really trying to emphasize this as the way to solve the problem, while they're just completely stepping back as though they have no responsibility in the process at all, when they've played a key role at not actually reining in racist police violence. They approve the budget every year with a continuously bloated police budget, while we have activists and community members trying desperately to get more money toward affordable housing, more money toward mental health services, and more money toward a lot of homelessness services and the other things that communities actually need, as opposed to the over-policing that we often see.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, can we reform the police? And one of the slogan of the movement was another way was the defund of the police, which was very interesting slogan going around. So can we reform the police, and how can we do it if yes?
I think it's a good set of questions that the movement faces in this way. I think, while we're looking at a world of 8 billionaires controlling as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, while Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, is being talked about as though he can become the first trillionaire in history, I think while we're looking at 40 million people in the United States being unemployed, it's clear that U.S. capitalism is always going to look for some type of a repressive force to try and keep people in line. You cannot have this level of inequality and have the system be sustainable. It's truly not possible. And I think it's true as long as we have a handful of billionaires basically constantly profiting off of the situation, we'll see some type of police force or private security or something that is playing a role at both repressing protests. And I think this is why we're sort of in a struggle for the total transformation of society, to dismantle the police, to wage a political struggle against the establishment. And I think this is part of like we have to fight against the capitalist system to have this be truly a question of the total liberation of all people who are oppressed right now under the situation. So I think one of the main obstacles in this is also the question of the Democratic Party in the US, which is led by a million threads to the billionaires, the corporations, and frankly, to the police force. We're seeing, you know, council members in Minneapolis were elected with money from sections of the police force and with endorsements from the police union and all of that. And I think this is why, you know, there's also a fight in the US right now. And I think after the inspiration of the Bernie Sanders campaign, however, it must be noted that he hasn't played much of a role in this at all, which I think is an abdication of his responsibility as a leader within, you know, having inspired millions of people to get involved in grassroots activism. But I think this is why we need a new party for working class people, because we can't trust the Democratic Party to have the fights that are necessary. And we, you know, we need to have a party for working people that is unapologetically fighting as a part of social justice movements and is, you know, taking on a hostile city hall. And I think the best example of this truly is Shama Sawant in Seattle, also a member of Socialist Alternative. She has been fighting nonstop, and she's the only one who has consistently fought in Seattle for her last 2 terms on city council against giving more money to the police budget, and actually advocating very clearly for it to go toward, you know, more affordable housing, toward social services, and toward the things that working class communities actually need. She's now introducing a bill today to get rid of kind of all the toys, as you might say, all the various militarized equipment that the police have access to in Seattle. She's also fighting energetically to cut the police budget in half. And I think that these are key steps when there's a question of how can we defund the police, this being sort of a cry of the movement. I think we need to be very, very, very clear that defund the police, it's absolutely about fighting tooth and nail to have any money go toward the things that working class people need, toward public education, toward affordable, democratically controlled social housing, toward, you know, Medicare for all system, you know, so like these are part of in totality, I think, what it's going to take to actually confront racist policing as it exists right now. The last thing I'd say is, you know, locally in Minneapolis, we're really discussing also what would it look like to have, you know, a real community oversight over dismantling the Minneapolis Police Department. So, you know, what would it look like to fight for a top to bottom purge of the police forces across the country, where officers with histories of racism, sexism, and violence would be immediately fired by democratically accountable community oversight boards. And all of this would need to be connected immediately as well with taxing the billionaires and the corporations and building permanently affordable socially owned housing, a green jobs program, you know, quality public education, free transit, and healthcare for all, because we are constantly in a battle. I mean, for all of the times, again, the hypocrisy of the Democrats, for all of the times that they claim they can do nothing about the police departments, it's not like they're fighting with everything that they can to get us affordable public transit. They're basically just saying that they can never do anything. And I think that this is a real, this is the real political crisis that we're facing in the US right now. And partly why, again, Shama is such an important example, because just last night, there was a march, one of the, you know, solidarity marches that was taking place where there had been battles with the police over many nights now, where the police have tear gas protesters saying that they weren't going to. You know, the mayor has been saying that that's not being used, but it is, on peaceful protesters in Cal Anderson Park. Thousands of people marched from the park to City Hall, where Shama threw open the doors. And, you know, there's been a resounding call now for the mayor of the city of Seattle, Jenny Durkin, to resign, because she not only hasn't done anything in the situation, but again, repeatedly, like we've seen in Minneapolis, we see the lies that come from the police, their recounting of these stories on how these murders happen. They're not accurate, and they're not being held to account at all. And with all of the scaremongering around white supremacists, and, you know, the city establishment, both in Minneapolis, in Philadelphia, in Seattle, telling people to stay home from the protests, when the protests have actually been the most effective at winning and extracting concessions. You know, they're scaring us by saying it's white supremacists, but the city establishment isn't catching any of these white supremacists. And in reality, it's working class people self-organizing in our own communities that have done more than the police force to actually keep ourselves safe when we're at our homes. And I think if these can build into, a real community control over public safety in this situation, we can actually, I think, dramatically change the way that working class communities in the United States are run.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to change the subject a little bit and talk about the fact that Trump, with this, with the way that he dealt with the coronavirus situation, okay, but mainly with the way that he dealt with the movement by saying that he will be the government of the law and order, etc. He's losing ground not only in the society but also from his own party. And what will be that, do you think? I mean, it's obvious that all their arguments are not working about, as you mentioned, not even the use of the National Guard, not even the threats about the white supremacists. So nothing is working to stop the movement. So they are in a very bad situation now. So do you think that there is a possibility that Trump is going to lose? I mean, even members of their own party, his own party, said that they're thinking whether they will vote for him in the next elections.
Yeah, I think it's funny to talk about the upcoming presidential election just because of how dramatically, I mean, since January, how dramatically the terrain has shifted. I mean, it's wild that Bernie Sanders was previously such an important factor in the context of the Democratic Party's nomination. And, for months, I think that there was it really looked like the movement around Bernie Sanders was the main vehicle for actually defeating the Donald Trump government, like just the reactionary role that he's played. And I think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is some of the inspiration of Bernie Sanders' campaign over the last year is coming into these protests in a certain way. And I think a lot of the fact that we're looking at working class people and our confidence being raised, expecting more, the fact that we've been talking about the need for healthcare, for everyone to have access to, some basic needs. I think a lot of that has really emboldened working class people to be demanding more in this situation. And I think that's partly why we're seeing Trump somewhat on the back foot as well, because, in some ways, what can he promise in the face of a movement where people across the country are seeing his blatant racism and seeing that, in reality, it's the multiracial working class movement from below that is, slowly extracting these concessions and small victories from local and state governments across the country. I think it's really going to be a challenging situation to call hard for a vote for Joe Biden. And I think that there will be a lot of pressure to vote for Joe Biden in an attempt to defeat Trump. But I think that it's incredibly important that we be clear that in reality, what Trump has emboldened over the last 6 years or 4 years as president, but the sort of bigotry and fear mongering that he introduced even prior to being elected, that all of this is actually something that isn't going to be easily put back in a box. And I think that it's in reality that sort of solidarity amongst working class people and the movement overall that will be a key force to actually defeat and push back the right wing that he has emboldened. And I think, the government of law and order especially is, I think it's just he's exposed, and the situation is just clearly showing what it looks like to have this type of law and order president. And so I think we have to be more genuinely talking about what does it take to build from below something, a force powerful enough to take on what he is emboldened in the reactionary situation that he is opened up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess even though there will be a lot of pressure to vote for Biden, I think that in a way the Democrats, even though they saw the hypocrisy, because in most of the states that the demonstrations have erupted and they faced the brutality of the police, the mayors or the the governing bodies anyway of the states was the Democrats, wasn't it? However, they are trying to materialize out of this movement to get the most of it. Yesterday, Biden was addressed the funeral of George Floyd. What do you think about that? Can they bring any change if Biden gets elected finally?
I mean, I think what we might see is, a sort of raised confidence of people having, it'll be a victorious feeling and having gotten Trump out of office. And there's a real possibility, I think, if Biden was elected, and I think he's leading in the polls at the moment, that actually, we could see the confidence of working class people even raised a bit higher, and the need for, deeper organizing, for broader organizing, for maybe more calls to have change happen even more quickly. There could be a real, enthusiasm for shifting things very fast, greater demands around climate change, greater demands around, a faster or more just transition. Potentially we would see Medicare for all back on the agenda in a real way, not because of Biden, but because the movement would be wanting to demand it from a Democratic presidency, especially after 4 years of Donald Trump. But I think that is exactly the situation wherein we have to, I think, talk more concretely about what will it actually take to win a Medicare for all system. The movement will need to challenge, the for-profit healthcare industry as it exists right now. And I don't think Joe Biden will be an ally in that process. He's been very clear he doesn't support Medicare for all, even in, facing Donald Trump in the situation we're in now. He was also quoted, the one thing he said very clearly in the context of this resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement is that possibly police should be trained to shoot people in the leg in a non-lethal way, which is just clearly out of touch with where people are at right now and with the demands of the movement and a total restructuring of, a community-led restructuring of the police force, and with demands to abolish the police. This is clearly not an adequate response, nor does it actually take up the key question of how can we actually deal with the police and the armed forces under capitalism. And it's clearly just a way to, I think has his fingers crossed that the movement dies down and he can become president and everything ends up fine. But, I think, again, the key thing will be the consciousness, I think, of working class and young people toward being able to extract real change. And I think that, the militancy in this situation right now really needs to become more about increased organizing, because if we're looking to either defeat Donald Trump and the right wing he is emboldened, or to win, enormous victories for the working class while Biden is president, we're going to need to be more organized. We need to have, real democratic structures for discussing the next steps in the movement. I think we really need to look toward what would it take to have the left wing of the labor movement playing a part in, building up a struggle for a new party. All of this, where can we have these democratic discussions? Can these community councils that have developed in terms of, the localized community defense, can they play more of a political role in the processes and reshaping what our city looks like in terms of Minneapolis? And I think all of that, could be on the table so long as we don't demobilize the movement where it stands right now, and really start to discuss what would it take to win the type of kind of social justice issues that we need, and start to address the really deeply rooted racism that exists in the context of the police violence we've seen.
Yeah, I want to go actually for the end of our program. I would like to go actually to these community committees that you mentioned that have been formed. Were they formed during the movement, and how do they work? Are they what is their essence? I mean, what are they discussing or not? Planning? How are they working and supporting the movement or feeding the movement?
Yeah, I think that, I don't want to overstate too much the level of kind of deeper political organizing involved in the community councils. But what we saw was when the establishment was talking about right-wing vigilantes and right-wing violence, and, basically saying that everywhere you look, there could be a white supremacist, which was, the scaremongering that they were using to try and get people to stay home from the protests. there were incidents of maybe suspicious fires in different neighborhoods across the city, or businesses, community institutions that were burned down, and people were just suspicious that these were as a result of the genuine protests that were happening. And so under those conditions, a lot of neighborhoods started to organize together to maybe have their own community patrol, or to develop different ways of communicating to get information that was accurate and to get information distributed that was timely. And, I think that those were really out of the necessity of the moment, and really trying to figure out how to address the immediate public safety issue, because the police were not going to be a resource and the National Guard were not being helpful at all. And at the same time, it was unclear how much this sort of vigilante violence was a factor. And so, really, I think it's just a question of envisioning how effective could those, neighborhood by neighborhood councils, or, could they come in together into something that could be more sustainable, and actually start to discuss what the city could look like, reshaped, from the ground up by these types of forces, and by working class people being organized in a persistent and in an ongoing way. Because, not everyone agrees on what the next steps are. Not everyone agrees that, that there's a, core structural problem to the Minneapolis Police Department. People believe that there's something that needs to be changed, but I think some of the broader conclusions around how much this is linked to, the state continuously protecting private property, or the fact that we have billionaires just getting richer, and, that working class people are in a constant struggle for our basic needs. I think all of these things can be on the table for discussion, next steps within the movement.
Mm-hmm. Do you think these community committees can play this role? I mean, is there a discussion of becoming something more permanent that will lead the movement, or change the movement into something more permanently, and like being the core of a new left or a new movement?
I think it's a really interesting set of questions. And again, I think that they were formed out of some very spontaneous and immediate need. And I could see in some places maybe they would continue in some form. But I think, it's hard to say exactly. And I think, in the moment, it's an important part of the overall discussion, because it points in the direction of, in the face of crisis, working class people actually better solved the situations in front of them. We saw incidents also of, the Somali community, which is very big in Minneapolis. They actually confronted some suspicious men who came by, and they thought we're going to try and start a fire. They confronted those men without using rubber bullets and without using pepper spray. So we're seeing that communities have actually been able to figure out solutions to their own crises far better than the way that the state or the city hall has equipped them to do.
Mm-hmm. So what is the way forward? What would you say that the movement would need to, in order to go forward, and how we build a new left finally? I mean, there was a discussion about a new left, and it's obviously now with the collapse of the Trump administration and the hypocrisy of the Democrats, that a new left party for the working class is needed, is necessary. What are the next steps that has to be taken in order for this to materialize?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're talking explicitly about what it would look like to launch, an elected community-led, restructuring of the Minneapolis Police Department, with an elected civilian review board with real teeth, with real control over hiring and firing and budget priorities, and an ability to enforce these priorities, with the power to subpoena as well. And I think all of this actually could be a model that could be spread nationally. In all cities across the U.S. And I think part of that discussion is very explicitly the idea of defunding these police departments. But this is in the interest of pushing toward community control over public safety, and that needs to be explicitly linked to standing unequivocally on taxing the rich and taxing big corporations to invest in green jobs, to invest in social programs, in public education, and permanently affordable social housing. And I think too frequently we're seeing that actually it's the Democratic Party that has stood in the way of these types of efforts and initiatives. And I would really say that, like, when it comes to the left wing of the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, I think they need to be much clearer about unequivocally standing with the movement on these issues and fighting tooth and nail toward an actual rebuilding of a left alternative that can challenge the Democratic Party and all of its kind of billionaire ties and all of that. And I think that's where the call for a new party is so critical and is so important. And I think we're going to see that type of debate and discussion really start from the ground up, I think, in cities across the country who have experienced the Democrats actually pushing on this police violence. But I think we also need to be entirely clear that, you know, as socialists, police violence is part and parcel of the capitalist system, which rests on this structural racism and inequality. And I think a society without police repression can only be built on socialist foundations where the economy is democratically controlled to improve the lives of all people. And I think that's also, I think, some of the conclusions that young people especially are drawing in the context of the current situation is that we really need a political alternative, and that the way that things are going right now is completely unsustainable for humanity and for you know, ordinary people to thrive in this environment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes. Thank you very much, Ginger, for all this time that you've given us and the amazing description of the whole situation and the whole information that you gave us for what is happening in the US. And of course, about the messages that exactly if we want to have, we cannot have capitalism without racism. I mean, it's a slogan that we hear very often in the demonstrations, and we really need a structural change of the whole system if we want to stop this police brutality and have a society equal for all. Thank you very much for the talk, and good luck with the continuation of the movement.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much all for being here today with us and listening to our program. If you liked what you heard and what you saw, click to our website and get information for more, nedacy.wordpress.com and internationalsocialist.net. And of course, listen to Radio Ubuntu for amazing music and more discussions to come. Thank you very much and see you next week.
Secccar, molla kısa dök bir çay. Fabrika parça başı, yettirdin mi maaşı? Ev içi görülmez emek, sigorta yok, yol ve yemek. Nevli ferah zamanlar, burada herkes bırakar. Burada herkes bırakar. Yektü secccar, ne yerim ne yerim dar. Ev kira sokak bizim, değil benim krizim. İşsizdir tüm çalışanlar, mavi beyaz ne farkın var? Hakimse yasalar, yıkılsın piyasalar, yıkılsın piyasalar, yıkılsın piyasalar. Yıkılsın piyasalar.